It's the dead of winter here in Queensland. It's been so cold I almost had to put on some shoes. But work must continue on the shed if I'm going to create my oasis away from the troubles of everyday life. We left off in the last video having lined the walls of the shed with 9mm ply. There was a lot of this old tongue and groove hoop pine that we took out of the house during renovations, so I had the idea to build a rustic timber feature wall with it. It was in fairly rough shape, so I acquired a thicknesser planer in the hope that it would bring back a fresh face to these planks. While coming up with a plan of attack for this project, I came across this idea of using a long flat piece of something to slide your workpiece on while running it through the thicknesser. I handily had this piece of melamine hanging about, so it became that piece of something. It probably has a real name. Slide board, maybe? I just cut some spaces to make it level. Before running the timber through the machine, I first went over it with a metal detector to sniff out any nails that could be hiding in it. At the same time, I took to it with a scraper to remove any chunky bits that would prevent it from sitting flat on the slide board while running through the thicknesser. So then it came time to actually run some boards through. They looked much better straight away, and any doubt I had about taking on this project quickly dissolved. The timber stack was fairly big though, and I knew I had a lot of work ahead of me before I could see the final result up on the wall. I plugged away at it, running the boards through in batches, using the metal detector to find any nails, and giving them all a good scraping first. I only had one mishap where I forgot to recheck a board for nails after removing the first lot. This meant that my thicknesser blades had a gouge in them, which transferred some ugly lines into the timber. The blades are double-sided, so I turned them around to use the good side, and in the meantime I acquired some replacements. All in, it took 3.5 sets of blades to get through the entire stack of timber, which had become quite hard over the 100 odd years that it was in the house. The thicknessing process was by far the most time-consuming part of the job, taking 5 solid days all up. If you watch closely, you can see my beard getting longer in the time lapse. Also, this thing is loud. I'm pretty sure my neighbours hate me at this point. I'll have to shout them some beer to make up for it. But I was happy with how they turned out, even if there was still a bit of snipe on the end of the boards. They'll have to be cut to fit on the wall anyway. Some of them that were cupped I kept around in case I ran low on material, and they could be sanded down in a pinch. The next job to prepare the timber was to rip them to width on the table saw, but it was becoming a chore to clean up sawdust every day, so I went and bought a dust collector. This one comes highly recommended for a small workshop like mine. So I threw it together and hoped for the best. Now on to ripping the boards. I noticed while handling the timber that the boards were a bunch of different widths. A few were conveniently at 150mm and just needed the tongues cut off them. The rest ranged between 128 and 135mm, so it was decided to rip all of them to 128 to maintain some uniformity. Once the saw was set up, I started on the 150mm boards, which I plan to use on the bottom of the wall, up until the height of the planned workbench. These wider boards were in pretty decent condition, so they were done quickly and without drama. Just the way I like it. The narrower boards you can see here, however, had to be scraped along the edge that was to be against the table saw fence. Most of them had blobs of dried paint or some sort of lumpiness that would keep them from running tight up against the fence and giving an inaccurate cut. It was worth the effort though, I think. All this old timber was starting to look like something after having a run through the table saw. This job was a lot quicker than the thickness of work, for which my neighbours and I were all thankful. The new dust collector worked okay, although there was still a fair amount of sawdust on the floor after running a batch of boards through. I suspect this is more to do with the design of the dust outlet on the cheapo table saw than the fault of the collector. But all up, it took about a day to get through all the table saw work. The first part of preparing a wall for lining is just to move everything out of the way. This linisher was dyno bolted to the floor for doing metal work. It will eventually end up bolted to a workbench once I build some. My original plan was to screw all the timber straight onto the steel frame, but the more I thought about that, the more I realised how terrible it would look. Screw heads just aren't pretty in my book. So, as you can see, I bit the bullet and bought a bunch of pine stud. I then started cutting out the studs and screwing them in beside the steel frames. That was a pretty easy job, so I thought I'd try and get the little studs up in the truss done to make the next day a bit more cruisy. There was a fair amount of faffing about initially, but I found that the best way to get them in was to screw a small piece of something into the steel truss to help locate the stud, and then screw the stud to that piece. Here's a better shot of what I mean. Also, leaving the lower wall studs till later meant that I could screw the little truss studs from below. I made sure to line up the timber in the truss with where I intended to put the lower pieces by marking a line with the aid of a level. And with a bit more plugging along, the fiddly bits were done. The next day turned out to be the cruisy day I envisioned. The neighbour boys dropped by to see what was happening. They offered me a hand and brought with them some youthful enthusiasm and pleasant conversation. Most of the timber studs were screwed straight onto the steel studs. The steel studs are made from C-channel, so spaces were needed on some of them where the orientation was reversed. The spaces were just made from some of the pine stud offcuts. And it was done. Good times. And finally it's time to see if my rustic timber feature wall will look as good as I pictured in my brain, or if it will make it into my book. After throwing up a bit of insulation, I cut me up some timber and I was off. There were different shades of wood grain and varying levels of rusticness I had to deal with, so I tried my best to mix it up a bit. I just cut the rough end off the board I was working with and checked on the wall where it would fit. No real science to it. Some of the boards had broken strips on them from when they were torn off the walls of the house, but I reckon they added to the rustic feel. I tried not to put these broken ones too close together though. I worked my way up the wall, checking occasionally that it was all lined up with the use of a laser level.
We all came down with the lurgy for a couple of weeks, which was enough time for this board to upset me, so I replaced it. And after that 2-week break, I was keen to get the rest of this timber up on the wall. Finally, the wall was done. I'm really happy with how it turned out. It's just the right amount of rusticness I was going for. Some of the gaps show the steel frame through the timber, so I think I'll use some black gap filler on them. But there's still some work to do in the shed. There's a lot of trim pieces that need to go up, and some paint and timber oil around the place wouldn't go astray. But all that will be in the next video on the shed.
Thanks for watching till the end, I really do appreciate it. If you like the cut of my jib and reckon I deserve a beer for my troubles, check out my PayPal link in the description to make a one-off donation. Also, if you're in the market for some reasonably priced gear for photography and videography, click my affiliate link with Neewer and check out their wares. Here's cheers.